Ridgewood General Hospital always looked different at night, but on that cold January evening, the building felt heavier than usual, as if the snowstorm pressing against the windows had pushed the entire structure into silence. Outside, thick sheets of snow drifted from a black sky, swirling around the streetlights in lazy spirals. The parking lot was almost empty except for a few staff cars half buried under white powder. Inside, the hallways were dim, lit only by flickering ceiling lamps and the soft glow of computer screens at the Nightshift station. Most people hated the night shift,
No, this ends now.
He walked these same halls with
Please don't do
pushing his
this.
cleaning cart from floor to floor.
We can find another way.
No, this ends now.
Perfection. People said he had the sort of presence that made the hospital feel less lonely, even on nights like this when the world outside looked frozen and unfriendly. But something about Ethan seemed different that night. At around 11, he had arrived early, swiping his ID at the back entrance where the wind pushed against the door. He stood there for a moment before entering, his face unusually pale, his eyes scanning the hospital grounds as if expecting someone to be standing there in the snow. When he finally stepped inside, shaking frost from his coat, he whispered to himself in a tone no one could hear. Nurses later said they noticed his hands trembling slightly as he checked in at the time clock. Still, nobody questioned him. Ethan was reliable, maybe the most reliable person in the entire building. If he was acting strange, he probably had a good reason. The storm grew worse as the night went on. By midnight, the hospital felt cut off from the world. The wind howled so loudly that even the thick window glass vibrated. The few patients awake at that hour complained that the noise sounded like someone screaming outside, but the staff brushed off the comments. It was just the weather. Always the weather. Linda Parson, the senior night nurse, did her usual rounds at a steady pace, checking ink levels on machines, adjusting blankets, logging patient vitals. She passed Ethan twice and greeted him both times. The first time, he responded with a stiff smile, but the second time he didn't say anything at all. He just stayed down the hallway as if he were listening for something distant and important. She assumed he was tired. Everyone felt drained during storm nights. She didn't know that Ethan hadn't slept for 2 days. He had dark circles under his eyes, and when he blinked, his eyelids stayed shut half a second too long, like he was forcing himself awake. At 1:30 in the morning, Ethan's cleaning cart was parked near the elevator on the 3rd floor, positioned neatly as always. His mop was resting against the wall. The usual sight brought Linda a strange sense of comfort. She liked knowing Ethan was nearby, silently keeping things in order. But a few minutes later, when she walked down the same hallway again, she noticed something unusual. Ethan's cart hadn't moved, but his mop was standing upright in the bucket, dripping something dark onto the linoleum floor. At first, she assumed it was the red disinfectant solution he often used. It had a strong chemical smell, and in dim light it could look like blood. She crouched down to wipe the drip with a tissue, but the moment the smell touched her nose, she froze. This wasn't disinfectant. It was blood. Fresh blood. Thick and metallic. Her stomach tightened as she slowly stood up and looked around. The hallway was empty. Ethan's cleaning cart looked undisturbed except for that single detail. His janitor's room door, which usually stayed closed, was slightly open. Linda hesitated, then stepped inside. His coat, phone, and wallet was still in his locker. His thermos sat on the shelf, steam long faded. Her heart pounded. Ethan never left his belongings behind. Not once in 8 years. By 2 in the morning, the building felt even colder. The heating system had been struggling all night, but now the vents blew out only soft, icy air that made the lights flicker. Several nurses gathered at the station, whispering about the sudden temperature drop. Linda didn't want to alarm anyone, so she quietly walked toward the security office instead. She found Officer Raymond Neal drinking coffee and watching muted news on the tiny wall-mounted TV. When she told him Ethan's cart was abandoned and something seemed wrong, he sighed, assuming it was just a misunderstanding. But when she insisted he check the cameras, his expression darkened. He had known Ethan for years too. If Linda said something looked wrong, he trusted her instincts. Raymond rewound the footage to 1:45 a.m., the time Linda last saw Ethan. The screen showed Ethan pushing his cart down the hallway, pausing near the door to room 309. He looked tense, glancing behind him several times before slowly entering the room with his mop in hand. The timestamp jumped ahead a few minutes. The door never opened again. Ethan was gone. Raymond replayed it 3 times, hoping he had missed something. But the footage didn't lie. Ethan walked into room 309. He never walked out. Linda's face paled as she whispered, "Victor Hale's room." The name sent a cold shiver down her spine. Every nurse knew the stories about 309. Some refused to work that wing alone. Patients who had stayed there claimed they heard faint murmurs at night, or saw shadows move across the ceiling even when the room was empty. Others complained of feeling watched or touched by unseen hands. Most of the staff brushed it off as imagination triggered by stress, but privately, the room unnerved everyone. At 2:13 a.m., they hurried toward room 309, their footsteps echoing through the silent hallway. The door was closed, but a faint smudging stain trailed from it to Ethan's abandoned mop bucket. When Raymond pushed the door open, the room was dark except for the glow from the machines keeping Victor alive. The patient lay still on the
Please
bed,
don't
his eyes
do
shut,
this.
chest rising and falling in slow mechanical
We can
rhythm.
find
Nothing
another
seemed out of
way.
place
No,
at first,
this
until Raymond
ends
noticed the
now.
bed sheets. They were twisted as if
Please
someone had
don't
grabbed them
do
in panic.
this.
Ethan's gloves were lying on the floor
We
beside
can
the
find
bed.
another
A single
way.
footprint,
No,
bare,
this
human,
ends
was smeared in the
now.
dust near the bathroom door. But the bathroom was empty. The windows were sealed. The ceiling vents were too small for anyone to crawl through. There was no way out. No sign of Ethan. No reason for him to be gone. Only a strange coldness in the air that didn't match the heating system issues. It felt like the room itself was breathing. Linda hugged herself, rubbing her arms to fight the chill. Something about the silence felt wrong. It wasn't the normal hospital quiet. It was deeper, almost oppressive, as if the air inside the room was holding its breath. When Raymond called for backup on his radio, the static crackled violently for several seconds before finally connecting. Even then, the response was faint and broken. The storm outside continued to rage, slamming wind against the windows like fists. The search for Ethan began immediately, though only a handful of staff were present due to the storm. They combed the hallways, the stairwell, the basement storage area, and even the maintenance shafts. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no open doors or broken locks. It was as if he evaporated. One young nurse, shaken and pale, said she heard footsteps behind her while searching the south hallway, but when she turned around, the corridor was empty. Another claimed the elevator doors opened on their own, even though no one had pressed the button. Strange things like that kept happening throughout the search, small details that everyone tried to rationalize but couldn't explain. The entire third floor felt unnaturally cold, and the lights flickered every few minutes. At one point, the power dipped so low the machines inside the patient rooms beeped an alarm. Even after the electricity stabilized, the atmosphere remained heavy and tense, like the storm outside had seeped into the walls. Linda kept replaying the image of Ethan's mop dripping blood, over and over in her mind. Something terrible had happened, something she couldn't understand. She had known Ethan for years, shared coffee breaks with him, laughed at his quiet jokes. Now all she could think of was the look on his face a few hours earlier, the nervous way he had stared down the hallway, the trembling in his hands, the strange silence in his voice. By the time the clock neared 4 a.m, the search had turned into a nightmare. Staff were frightened, whispering theories and fears they didn't dare say out loud. Raymond stood outside room 309, staring at the door as if expecting Ethan to walk out any second. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. Something was wrong with that room, something none of them understood. And whatever it was, it had taken Ethan cold during his last shift. A shift that should have been ordinary. A shift he never walked away from. Room 309 had earned a reputation long before the night Ethan disappeared. Even during the day, the room carried an uneasy stillness, a coldness that didn't match the rest of the hospital. Some nurses joked that the thermostat was broken, but deep down, everyone knew it wasn't the temperature that bothered them. It was the feeling. A low, crawling discomfort that clung to you the moment you stepped inside. New staff noticed it first. They would walk into the room for the very first time and immediately pause, as if invisible hands were pressing against their chest. The fluorescent lights above would flicker without warning, even though maintenance replaced them regularly. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than anywhere else in the building. Patients consistently requested transfers from that room, claiming they felt watched at night or heard the soft sound of someone whispering near their bed, even when they were alone. Over the years, Some patients reported seeing a dark figure standing at the foot of their bed. Others described waking up unable to move, convinced someone was sitting in the chair beside them. The staff dismissed these stories as stress-induced hallucinations. After all, hospitals were places of fear, sickness, long nights, and anxiety. But privately, most nurses admitted they avoided room 309 whenever they could. Victor Hale had been assigned to that room because it was one of the quietest. After surviving a brutal home invasion that left him with severe head trauma, he had fallen into a coma from which he hadn't awoken for 6 long months. He was the only survivor of the attack, and detectives believed he knew something important, something that could identify the intruder. But that chance faded with every passing day he remained unconscious. Still, even in his coma, Victor appeared unsettled. Sometimes his fingers twitched violently. Sometimes his heart monitor spiked for no clear reason. And sometimes, in the still hours of the night, he moved his lips slightly, as if whispering to someone unseen. No one could explain it. No one wanted to think too hard about it either. When Ethan entered room 309 at 1:47 that morning, everything about the room seemed darker than usual. The machines beside Victor beeped steadily, but the sound felt distant, almost muted. The door clicked shut behind Ethan, sealing him inside a space filled with an unnatural cold that bit through his uniform. He had cleaned the room dozens of times before, but that night the air felt different, heavier, like something unseen was waiting for him. What
Please
happened next
don't
inside
do
the room
this.
was lost to the 8 minutes of missing camera footage.
We can
But what the
find
investigators
another
found
way.
out
No,
was disturbing
this
enough to shake
ends
everyone.
now.
By the time detectives arrived
Please
later that
don't
morning,
do
the
this.
entire hospital was buzzing with fear.
We
Staff
can
whispered in
find
corners,
another way.
glancing
No,
nervously down hallways,
this ends
especially the one
now.
leading to room 309. Several nurses refused to go near it, insisting they had heard something strange during the search for Ethan. Footsteps, low murmurs, shifting shadows. The investigators dismissed these claims as panic, but as they walked toward the room, even they couldn't ignore the strange atmosphere. The closer they got, the colder the hallway became. One detective rubbed his arms and commented that the heating must be broken again, but when maintenance checked, they found nothing wrong. The vents were pushing out warm air. Yet the corridor felt like a refrigerator. When the detectives finally stepped into room 309, their breath caught in their throats. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow from the monitors. Victor lay in bed, motionless, exactly as he had for months. But the bed sheets were twisted and pulled to one side, as if someone had struggled there. The pillow had fallen to the floor. Ethan's gloves were lying near the bed frame, one turned inside out, the other smeared with something dark. A faint set of barefoot prints led from the foot of Victor's bed to the bathroom, each print marked with dust in a strange streaking pattern, but there was no one inside the bathroom. The room's window was tightly sealed. The vents were too small for even a child to crawl through. The door had remained closed from the outside. There was no explanation for how anyone, including Ethan, could have disappeared. The detectives questioned the nurses about the room's history. Some hesitated to speak, afraid of sounding superstitious. Others admitted they had avoided that room for years. One nurse confessed that she once saw the heart monitor spike wildly while the patient was asleep, even though all other vitals showed no change. Another claimed she saw a shadow move across the wall from the corner of her eye, but when she turned, nothing was there. These strange occurrences didn't start with Victor. They had been happening long before him, long before the hospital tried to ignore the room's reputation. Maintenance records showed that electrical issues had been reported repeatedly. Lights flickering, outlets sparking, devices malfunctioning, but only in room 309. Repairs were made over and over, yet the problems always returned. When the hospital first opened, room 309 had been used for psychiatric observation. Old records mentioned a few patients who became violent without warning, claiming they heard voices inside the walls. One patient insisted someone stood in the shadows every night, speaking to him, threatening him. He refused to sleep with the lights off. Another patient was found trembling in the corner, staring at the bathroom door as if something unimaginable was behind it. These accounts were buried in old files, quietly pushed aside when the hospital expanded. No one wanted to think the room itself was the problem. The detectives interviewed Victor's relatives, hoping to find a connection between his attack and Ethan's disappearance. They learned that Victor had whispered something to a nurse shortly after first being admitted, right before slipping back into unconsciousness. His voice had been faint, barely audible, but his words were unforgettable. I didn't escape. He followed me. At the time, the nurse assumed it was a dream or memory of the attack. Now, in light of Ethan's disappearance, those words seemed chillingly relevant. The investigators requested access to the hospital security footage again. They studied the hallway outside room 309 frame by frame. At 2 minutes after Ethan entered the room, the lights in the hallway flickered, just for a second. In that 1 second, a tall, thin shadow stretched across the wall near the door, but no person was visible. When the lights steadied again, the shadow was gone. The detectives replayed the clip repeatedly, trying to determine if it was a glitch or distortion. The shape appeared elongated, unnatural, bending in a way that did not match any human posture. They couldn't confirm what it was, but they also couldn't explain it away. Inside the room, Victor remained unresponsive, unaware of the chaos around him. Yet something strange began happening around him in the following days. Nurses reported small changes in his facial expressions, tiny flinches in his fingers, sudden spikes in heart rate. It was as if the room was agitated, as if something inside it had awakened. One night, a nurse swore she heard Victor murmuring quietly, even though he was deep in a coma. She leaned close, convinced she imagined it, but the whispering continued for several seconds. She heard only one clear word: run. She refused to go near room 309 after that. The hospital tried to calm the staff, assuring them that stress from the storm and the ongoing investigation was making them imagine things. But the atmosphere continued to deteriorate. Some employees claimed they felt watched whenever they passed the room. Others said they saw movement through the small window in the door even though they knew the patient couldn't move. A few even complained of headaches and dizziness whenever they entered, symptoms that vanished the moment they stepped out. The investigators returned multiple times, gathering every detail they could. The absence of evidence became evidence in itself. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no biological traces that could identify another person.
Please
the only
don't
unexplained
do
details
this.
were the footprints, the disturbed bed,
We can
the
find
malfunctioning
another
camera,
way.
No,
feeling,
this
an overwhelming
ends
feeling
now.
that something was wrong with room 309.
Please don't do
Something that had been wrong
this.
for years. As rumors spread,
We can
the
find
hospital
another
administration
way.
considered
No,
transferring
this
Victor to another
ends
room,
now.
but their attempt was interrupted when the patient's vitals suddenly dropped. Doctors rushed in to stabilize him, and after several tense minutes, his heartbeat returned to normal. Moving him now, they said, might risk worsening his condition. So Victor stayed in the room that no one wanted, in the bed where the last known person to see Ethan alive had vanished without a trace. The detectives left late that evening, but before exiting the building, one of them turned back for a final glance down the hallway. Room 309 sat at the very end, its door slightly ajar now, a faint strip of cold light spilling into the dark corridor. The detective paused, staring at it for several long seconds, feeling a strange unease crawling beneath his skin. He later admitted he couldn't explain why, but in that moment, he felt as if someone, or something, was staring back at him from inside the room. Whatever had happened to Ethan Cole, whatever secrets room 309 held, this was only the beginning. And deep in the persistent silence of that room, something was waiting. The morning after Ethan's disappearance, the storm finally weakened, but inside the hospital, the tension only grew heavier. Everyone walked a little faster, spoke in quieter voices, and avoided the third floor whenever possible. Rumors spread quickly, whispered in corners, carried from shift to shift like unwelcome news traveling through a frightened town. No one wanted to think about Ethan too much, yet everyone did, replaying their last memory of him, wondering if they had missed a clue or ignored a sign. But the real fear began when the detectives returned with a request that made the staff even more uneasy. They wanted every scrap of recorded material from the past week, camera feeds, audio files, security logs, even old archive tapes stored in the locked room behind the security office. That room rarely opened. Most of the files inside had been forgotten by everyone except Raymond Neal, the night security officer who knew the building better than anyone else. He had been working there for nearly 2 decades and considered himself unshakable, but when the detectives asked him to gather the old tapes, he hesitated. Something about those recordings made his stomach twist, but he didn't say why. Instead, he pulled out a large ring of keys, unlocked the storage room, and stepped inside with a flashlight. The storage room was cramped, lined with metal shelves holding years' worth of labeled tapes, USB drives, and old hard drives from a time before the hospital upgraded its system. Dust covered everything like a thin blanket. The air smelled stale, untouched. As Raymond dug through the shelves, the detectives waited outside, murmuring to each other about timelines, missing persons, and unexplained camera malfunctions. But then Raymond froze. His light stopped on a small unmarked box shoved behind the older labeled tapes. It was out of place, deliberately hidden. He pulled it out carefully, noticing how the dust had settled unevenly around it, as if someone had moved it recently. When he opened the box, inside lay a stack of tapes with no labels, only dates, old dates, ones that went back years, even before Victor Hale had arrived. A chill ran down his spine. He remembered these tapes vaguely, though he had never watched them. They were related to incidents, the kind that administration buried quietly to avoid panic or lawsuits. He lifted them out slowly, each tape feeling heavier than the last. When he carried the box out to the detectives, he avoided their eyes. He didn't want to explain what he suspected. He didn't want to admit that room 309 had been a problem long before Ethan disappeared. The detectives brought the tapes into the main office and connected an old player to the monitor. Only 3 people were allowed inside: the lead investigator, his partner, and Raymond, who reluctantly stayed in case the footage needed context. The first tape flickered to life with a grainy timestamp showing a date from 9 years earlier. The footage was from the interior of room 309. The room looked slightly different back then, with older equipment and a different paint color. But the feeling on screen was the same: dim, cold, uncomfortable. A patient lay in the bed, a middle-aged woman named Mary Ann Colton, according to Raymond's faded memory. She had been admitted after a severe panic attack, but the details were vague. Her file had probably been archived years ago. The footage showed her sitting upright in bed, trembling violently, clutching at her sheets. She kept glancing toward the corner of the room, her eyes wide with terror. The investigators leaned in. Mary Ann suddenly jerked her head toward the camera, her mouth moving rapidly as though speaking. But the tape had no audio. They watched helplessly as she pointed toward the ceiling, then toward the bathroom door, her gestures frantic and desperate. Moments later, she pressed herself back against the wall, as if trying to escape something approaching her. Her breathing looked fast and shallow. She screamed, but the silent tape only showed her mouth opening wide. Then, without warning, she collapsed onto the bed, unconscious. The screen flickered, then cut to static. The recording ended. The detectives exchanged uneasy looks, but Raymond urged them to watch the next one.
Please
He didn't know
don't do
why,
this.
but he felt they had to. The second
We
tape
can
showed a different
find
patient.
another
A young
way.
man
No,
who appeared calm
this
at first.
ends
He lay
now.
asleep, unmoving.
Please
But around
don't
3 minutes
do
into
this.
the footage, the lights in the room began to flicker.
We can find
The shadows
another
on the walls
way.
stretched
No,
unnaturally,
this
shifting
ends
positions
now.
even though nothing in the room moved. The young man's fingers twitched. His eyes darted beneath his eyelids. Suddenly he sat up straight, as if jolted awake by a nightmare. But his expression didn't look confused or sleepy. It looked horrified. He stared at the foot of the bed, shaking his head slowly, whispering words the camera couldn't capture. Then he threw himself out of the bed violently, landing on the floor with a force that made Raymond flinch in real time. The young man scrambled toward the bathroom, but before he reached it, the lights flashed again, and the footage cut out. When the screen returned, he was lying motionless beside the bed, unconscious. He survived his stay, but only for 2 weeks before being transferred to a psychiatric clinic. Raymond swallowed hard, remembering what the nurses used to whisper after shift changes. The boy claimed the room spoke to him at night. They all ignored him. The detectives inserted tape after tape, each more unsettling than the last. Some showed patients crying silently, some showed them staring at corners or shadows that weren't there, and some showed them being woken up by things the camera couldn't see. One tape in particular made all 3 men lean forward, their expressions tightening. It featured a patient who had repeatedly complained about someone whispering in his ear at night. The hospital had installed a temporary audio-enabled camera in his room as a precaution. The recording was low quality, filled with static, but the audio remained intact. For the first few minutes, only the patient's labored breathing filled the room. Then something faint rose beneath it, another sound, softer, almost like a second voice. Not quite human but not entirely indecipherable either. The whispering grew louder, and although the words weren't clear, the tone was urgent, aggressive, almost angry. The patient woke up with a scream, clutching his ears, shouting that someone was standing beside him. On the tape, no one appeared beside his bed, but the whispering continued, louder and sharper until the patient collapsed back onto the mattress, sobbing. The detectives paused the tape. One rubbed his temples. The other checked the hallway through the small window in the door as if expecting something to be watching them. Raymond felt cold sweat running down his back. He couldn't believe he had forgotten these events, or maybe he had forced himself to forget. Just when they thought the tapes couldn't get any worse, the detectives loaded the last one. It was dated only 3 months before Victor Hale arrived. The room appeared dimmer than in any of the other recordings. The timestamp blinked irregularly, and the camera occasionally flickered. The patient in this tape was a man in his 60s, admitted for chest complications. He slept peacefully for most of the footage. But near the end, something changed. The camera shook slightly, as if someone had bumped it, though no one else was in the room. A dark shape appeared briefly in the lower corner of the frame, almost like a moving shadow, but the angle made it impossible to identify. The man stirred in his sleep, then opened his eyes suddenly. His expression didn't look like someone waking naturally. It looked like someone sensing danger. He turned his head toward the shadowed corner, blinking rapidly, breathing faster, whispering something that resembled a plea. The shadow shifted again, stretching upward as if growing taller. The man's heart monitor began beeping erratically. He reached out his hand weakly toward the call button but never touched it. The lights in the room flickered violently, almost strobing, and the video cut out. When it resumed, doctors were rushing into the room. The patient had suffered sudden cardiac arrest. He didn't survive. When the tape ended, the room fell silent. The detectives sat motionless, struggling to process what they had seen. Raymond finally spoke, his voice barely steady. He confessed that the administration had once considered sealing off room 309 permanently. They believed the constant malfunctioning, patient panic episodes, and unexplained events made the room unsafe. But it was easier, cheaper, and quieter to ignore the rumors and continue using the room, especially when patients eventually moved out and the problems seemed to fade temporarily. Raymond admitted he had always suspected something was wrong with the room itself, something beyond electrical issues or structural problems. He had felt it too many nights, an oppressive pressure, a cold draft when the vents were off, the sensation of someone standing behind him when he knew he was alone. But he never voiced these fears, afraid of losing his job or being dismissed as paranoid. The detectives realized these tapes weren't just evidence of past incidents, they were pieces of a larger puzzle. Whatever had been happening in room 309 had been happening for years, escalating quietly, unnoticed, unaddressed. And now, with Ethan missing, the room's dark history could no longer be ignored. But as they prepared to leave the office, the monitor flickered unexpectedly. For a brief second, the screen showed a static-filled image of room 309 in its current state. The bed, the machines, the shadowed walls, and in the far corner, something seemed to be moving. A shape, almost like a person, standing perfectly still.
Please
The
don't
image vanished
do
as quickly as
this.
it appeared. The screen went black.
We can find
one spoke.
another way.
No one
No,
breathed.
this
Deep
ends
inside the
now.
hospital, room 309
Please
waited.
don't do
Detective Harris had
this.
spent his entire career learning how to
We
read a
can
room,
find
how to
another
interpret
way.
silence,
No,
how to
this
feel the weight of a
ends
place even
now.
before a single piece of evidence revealed itself. But nothing prepared him for the crushing heaviness of the Mullen City Hospital basement. As he stepped off the final stair, the air turned noticeably colder, almost damp, as if the walls themselves were sweating. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong, like this part of the building had been forgotten on purpose. The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead flickered just enough to feel unreliable, casting jerky shadows on the cracked tiles below. Harris paused at the bottom, letting his flashlight sweep over the long concrete corridor that stretched into darkness. The hospital administration claimed this basement level had been closed for years due to renovations that never happened, but the stale smell of chemicals and the faint, metallic scent reminded him of a place that had been used recently. He could almost sense activity in the walls, faint echoes that didn't quite reach the ears but scratched at the mind. As he began walking forward, his shoes made soft tapping sounds on the floor, the noise bouncing back as if the corridor were a hollow shell. The further he moved, the more he noticed details that felt out of place. Old medical carts with dust patterns that suggested they'd been moved recently. A stack of empty cardboard boxes that didn't look as if they'd aged like the rest of the basement. A clipboard lying on the floor with a blank sheet clipped to it, but smeared faintly at the corner as though handled by a dainty thumb. Little things, small clues, barely there yet impossible to ignore. Halfway down the hall, he stopped at a heavy metal door painted in peeling blue. A sign was bolted on crookedly, reading Storage B. The lettering looked newer than everything else around it. Harris reached for the handle and pulled, expecting it to resist, but it opened with a soft groan as if someone had oiled it recently. The room beyond was dim, lit only by a small overhead bulb that barely cast enough glow to reach the walls. Shelves lined the space, but instead of equipment, they were stacked with patient files. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. Harris stepped inside slowly, running his finger along the nearest stack. The folders were arranged too neatly, too deliberately. He opened one. Inside were photographs, notes, and psychological evaluations, yet the names were not in any hospital records he had seen before. Many files lacked last names entirely. Some only had numbers. Others had no identifying information at all, just descriptions of behavior, violent episodes, dissociation, refusal to speak, uncontrollable panic. He flipped to the back of one folder and froze. A photo of a restrained man, eyes wide and unfocused, mouth open mid-scream, his wrist strapped to a bed rail. The faint outline of a room behind him looked nothing like a standard hospital ward. It looked like a basement cell. Harris closed the folder and set it aside, forcing his breath to steady. Something was deeply wrong here, and he realized suddenly that Raymond, the missing custodian, must have seen something in this place, something he shouldn't have. For days the hospital insisted they had no hidden spaces, no unauthorized treatment rooms, and no patient activity in the basement. Yet this storage room alone was enough to prove otherwise. As he backed out into the hallway again, his light caught a set of faint footprints on the floor. They were dusty, slightly smudged, but unmistakably recent. They led past Storage B and continued down the corridor to a section where the lights were dead, swallowed entirely by darkness. Harris followed them with slow, deliberate steps, careful not to disturb the prints. The trail ended abruptly in front of another door. This one had no sign, no handle, just a flat metal surface with chip paint and bolts along the edges. It resembled something more industrial than medical, the kind of door used to secure something rather than provide access. He pressed his ear against it, and for a moment he thought he heard something, perhaps a faint hum, maybe even a whisper, but it vanished too quickly to identify. His radio crackled in his pocket, startling him. Dispatch reported nothing new. No new sightings of Raymond. No updates from the officers checking security footage of nearby streets. But something in Harris's gut told him the truth was right here, behind this unmarked door. He stepped back, braced himself, and slammed his shoulder into it. The metal clanged but didn't budge. He tried again. The third time, the bottom bolt snapped loose and the door creaked inward, dust falling from the hinges like old ash. Inside was darkness so thick it swallowed the light from his flashlight. The beam stretched forward weakly at first and then illuminated something unexpected, stairs leading down even deeper. A sub-basement, a secret level beneath the already forgotten one. As he descended, the temperature dropped again, and the smell changed. It was no longer the scent of damp walls or chemicals. It was something more sterile, more controlled, like industrial disinfectant mixed with cold air and faint traces of rubber. The stairs ended at a long hallway identical in design to the one above but in far cleaner condition. The walls here were white, the floors free of dust. It looked maintained. Used.
Please
active.
don't do
Harris's
this.
heart began to pound. Someone had been
We
working
can
down
find
here recently.
another way.
No, this
He moved
ends
forward slowly until he
now.
heard it. A soft
Please
rhythmic sound
don't
coming
do
from somewhere
this.
ahead. A beeping. Very
We
faint
can
but steady.
find another
Not the
way.
beep of a fire
No,
alarm
this
or
ends
ventilation.
now.
It was the beep of a medical heart monitor. Harris tightened his grip on the flashlight and followed the sound until he reached another door, this one slightly ajar. The small window was too fogged and scratched to see through clearly. He pushed it open. The room inside was brightly lit, a harsh fluorescent glow reflecting off chrome equipment. And in the center of the room was a patient bed. But the person lying on it was not a patient at all. It was Raymond. The custodian looked practically lifeless, his skin pale and his arms lying stiff at his sides. Electrodes were attached to his chest, connected to a monitor that beeped softly with a slow, steady rhythm. Tubes were taped to his arms, leading to 4 bags filled with clear fluid. His clothes had been replaced with a hospital gown, and his wrists were strapped to the bed rails. But what disturbed Harris most was the expression on his face. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, unmoving, unblinking. Harris rushed to his side, tapping his cheek, calling his name. Raymond didn't respond. Not even a twitch. Yet the monitor insisted he was alive. As Harris leaned closer, he noticed something at the edge of the room. A metal tray with vials and syringes arranged in neat rows, each one labeled only with numbers. Beside the tray was a chart. Harris picked it up, scanning the notes. The handwriting was precise, almost cold in its neatness. The entries described behavioral tests, neurological responses, and something called Phase 3 induction. No names were listed, only identifiers. The last entry was dated just 1 day before Raymond disappeared. It read, Subject 14 showing signs of resistance. Prepare for containment. Harris's stomach twisted. Raymond wasn't just a witness. He had become part of whatever experiment was happening here. Before he could process the horror of it, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, calm, deliberate. Someone was walking toward the room. Harris stepped away from the bed and positioned himself near the wall beside the door, flashlight raised like a weapon. The footsteps grew louder until a shadow appeared in the doorway. The door opened fully, revealing Dr. Keller, the hospital's chief medical director. His face was unnervingly calm, as if seeing Harris here was not a surprise at all. You shouldn't be here, Detective, Keller said softly, his tone almost sympathetic. This level is restricted for a reason. Harris demanded answers, his voice low but shaking with contained anger. Keller sighed, stepping inside with a weary, almost disappointed expression. Raymond was not supposed to come down here. He saw something he should not have. He entered a space that exists to protect people, even people like him. Harris didn't buy a word of it. He pressed Keller against the wall, demanding to know what was being done to Raymond. But Keller remained eerily composed, almost serene, as if he had rehearsed this moment. These patients, Keller said slowly, are part of a program designed to help those the world has forgotten. Individuals who cannot function in regular society. We were trying to rehabilitate them in ways traditional medicine has failed to achieve. Harris stared at him in disbelief. No legitimate program would hide beneath a hospital, without records, without consent, and no treatment would involve strapping an unconscious custodian to a bed. Keller's gaze drifted to Raymond briefly before returning to Harris. This is bigger than you think, he said, and interfering will put more lives at risk than you understand. Before Harris could respond, the lights above flickered violently, and a loud metallic sound echoed from somewhere deep in the sub-basement. Keller's expression changed instantly. Not calm this time. Alarmed. Harris turned his flashlight toward the hallway, suddenly aware that something else was down here with them. Something Keller hadn't expected. Something he feared. And as the distant footsteps began to approach, slow and heavy and uneven, Harris realized with a sinking feeling that he and Keller were no longer alone. Detective Harris felt his heartbeat slam against his ribs as the footsteps grew louder, echoing through the hidden hallway with a slow and unnatural rhythm. The sound was heavy, dragging slightly, like someone whose legs didn't completely obey them. Dr. Keller stood frozen for a moment, staring toward the noise with an expression that mixed fear and resignation, the kind of look seen in someone who had been dreading this exact moment for a long time. Harris tightened his grip on his flashlight and stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between the approaching shadow and Raymond's motionless body on the bed. The distant footsteps grew clearer, steady but distorted, as though echo pushed them through thick, unseen layers of air. Harris's breathing slowed as he tried to steady himself. Whoever or whatever was coming, he needed to be ready. The hallway lights flickered again, this time more violently, buzzing like angry insects. The light inside the room dimmed just enough to deepen every shadow on the walls. Keller raised a hand, not to defend himself, but in a gesture that almost seemed like surrender. You have to understand.
Please don't
Keller
do
murmured,
this.
voice low and shaky now. It wasn't
We can
supposed to happen
find
like
another
this.
way.
Subjects weren't meant to be
this
exposed to
ends
stress
now.
without supervision. Harris
Please
shot him a
don't
sharp,
do
warning
this.
look. What subjects? He
We
demanded.
can find another
What exactly did
way.
you bring down
No,
here?
this
Keller
ends
didn't
now.
His eyes remained locked on the doorway as a figure finally appeared, first as a distorted silhouette, then as a misshapen form stumbling into view. It was a man. At least, it had once been a man. His hospital gown hung loose around a body that seemed frail yet oddly rigid. His arms were long and stiff, his shoulders hunched inward unnaturally, and his head twitched slightly to the side with each step, like a puppet moved by someone with poor coordination. His face was pale, drained of color, his eyes wide and blank, staring ahead without focus. Harris felt a sting of shock shoot through his chest. The man was alive, walking, breathing, yet there was something terribly wrong in the way he moved. Something stripped away from him. Something replaced with emptiness. Keller stepped carefully toward the man as if approaching a frightened animal. "He shouldn't be awake," Keller whispered. He wasn't ready for this phase. His neural responses must have spiked when the power flickered. The man's blank stare shifted slowly to Keller, and for a split second, a glimmer of recognition flashed across his hollow expression. Then, without warning, he lunged forward with shocking speed. Keller didn't have time to react. The man knocked him backward, slamming him into the wall with unnatural force, his bony fingers gripping the doctor's shoulders tightly enough to make Keller cry out in pain. Harris rushed forward, striking the man's arm with the flashlight. The figure barely reacted at first, then turned toward Harris with a slow, eerie movement like it took time for the command to reach his body. Harris swung again, harder this time, and the man stumbled backward, giving Keller a chance to escape his grip and scramble away. The blank-eyed man hissed softly, a sound that barely resembled human breath. It was thin, sharp, almost mechanical. Harris kept his flashlight raised. He didn't want to hurt the man, not knowing what he had been forced to endure, but he also couldn't let himself become the next victim. The man stared at him for a long moment, then slowly backed into the hallway, his movements twitchy and confused. Keller leaned against the opposite wall, gasping for air, rubbing his bruised shoulder. He wasn't violent before, he whispered. He's reacting to the disruption in his treatment. The neurological balance is broken. Harris's anger flared. What treatment? What did you do to these people? Keller's face sagged with defeat. We were trying to repair damaged minds, he said quietly. Some patients came to us with conditions that traditional psychiatry could not treat. Severe trauma, dissociation, violent tendencies, total withdrawal. We were testing a deep stimulation therapy that could rewire brain pathways. The basement was chosen to keep the environment controlled, quiet, away from stresses. But the process requires absolute stability. If it fails, the mind can break even further. Harris stared at him with disbelief and disgust. He pointed toward the door where the strange figure had disappeared. That man is broken because of you, he said. And Raymond, what did you do to him? Keller swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. He saw the subjects. He panicked. We couldn't let him run to the authorities without understanding what he had seen. We brought him here to calm him down, to keep him safe. But the therapy triggered unexpected responses in him too. We were trying to stabilize him. Harris almost laughed. The idea that Keller thought any of this could be justified was insane. Before he could respond, a distant crash echoed through the sub-basement. The sound of something falling, metal hitting tile, then another crash, then another. Harris realized with growing dread that more than one test subject was awake now. The power flicker, the door breaking open, the intrusion, all of it had disrupted the system that kept them sedated and monitored. Keller grabbed the detective's arm, eyes wide with fear. We have to get out of here, he said. If multiple subjects are unregulated, they might. He didn't finish. A scream echoed in the hallway, sharp and pained. Not from a patient, from a staff member. Someone else had been down here. Harris pushed past Keller and rushed into the hall, following the sound. He turned a corner and saw another room with the door flung open. Inside, a nurse lay on the ground, unconscious but breathing. A second subject stood over her, trembling violently, his fingers twitching at his sides like he was fighting against impulses he couldn't control. Something about the way he shook, the way he stared at the ceiling, reminded Harris of someone waking from a nightmare and realizing they were still inside it. Before the man could turn toward Harris, Keller arrived behind him, pressing a syringe into the subject's arm with practiced precision. The man collapsed instantly, falling to the floor in a heap. Keller's hands trembled as he dropped the empty syringe. This is why we operate down here, he muttered weakly. Nobody else would understand. Nobody else would fund a program like this. They don't see what we're trying to accomplish. Harris grabbed Keller by the collar. "This ends now," he said. "Where are the others? How many more are down here?" Keller hesitated, then admitted there were several patients in different stages of the experimental therapy. Some sedated, some roaming, some unpredictable. Harris realized the situation was spiraling out of control, and they had limited time before someone was seriously hurt or killed. And then he remembered Raymond, still strapped to a bed in the room behind them. He rushed back, Keller following closely. When they reached the room, Harris froze. Raymond's eyes were no longer staring blankly at the ceiling. He was looking directly
Please
at Harris.
don't do
His fingers
this.
twitched weakly against the restraints.
We
like he
can
was slowly
find
gaining
another
control of his
way.
body.
No, this
Raymond.
ends
Harris
now.
said cautiously, stepping
Please
closer.
don't do
Raymond's
this.
lips parted. A faint sound escaped.
We can
barely a
find
whisper,
another
broken and
way.
dry.
No,
Help
this
me.
ends
Keller
now.
stepped forward immediately, reaching for the four-line. Harris blocked him with an arm. "No more needles. No more drugs," he snapped. "You're not touching him again." Keller lowered his hand slowly, his expression heavy with guilt. "We can reverse this," he said. "If we get him out and stabilize him properly, he can recover. But not if the facility collapses into chaos." Harris ignored him, focusing on Raymond. He worked quickly to unstrap the restraints while Raymond blinked slowly, fighting through dizziness and confusion. Suddenly, a loud alarm blared through the basement. Red lights flashed along the ceiling, blinding and frantic. Keller's voice rose in panic. "The containment alarm. One of the subjects triggered the exit sensor. They're trying to escape the subbasement." Harris knew what that meant. If these unstable individuals reached the regular hospital floors, there would be chaos. People could get hurt. And the hospital administration, the same people who allowed Keller to run this secret program, would likely bury the truth rather than expose their involvement. Harris lifted Raymond carefully from the bed, draping the man's weakened arm over his shoulder. Raymond struggled to stand but nodded faintly, trying to help. Keller urged Harris to follow him. "There's a service elevator that leads to a locked hallway," he said. "We can reach the upper floor without crossing paths with the subjects. But we must hurry." They moved into the hallway just as another figure staggered out of a shadowed corner. Harris tensed, but this patient seemed barely conscious, leaning against the wall and sinking slowly to the ground as the alarm continued to blare. Keller guided them to a reinforced door at the end of the hall and swiped a keycard through the slot. The door clicked open, and inside was a small service elevator. Harris and Raymond stepped in first, Keller following behind. Just as the door began to slide shut, a loud bang struck the metal from outside. Harris instinctively pressed Raymond against the back wall and raised the flashlight again. A pale arm reached through the narrowing gap, grasping wildly. Keller slammed the emergency close button repeatedly. The door closed fully at the last second, cutting off the grasping hand with a metallic thud. The elevator ascended in jerky movements, rattling as if struggling under the stress of the alarm system. Keller leaned heavily against the panel, breathing hard. Harris stared at him, his voice low and tense. "When we get to the top, you're going to tell the police everything," he said. "No more lies. No more secrets." Keller didn't argue. He looked exhausted, defeated, almost relieved. "Maybe it's time," he whispered. "Maybe this place shouldn't exist." The elevator stopped with a jolt, and the doors opened to a quiet maintenance area near the back of the hospital. Harris helped Raymond to a nearby bench while Keller made a call to security, instructing them to seal the lower floors and contact emergency responders. Harris didn't care about hospital protocol anymore. He called the police department himself, providing exact details of the situation, leaving nothing hidden. By the time officers arrived, Keller had already surrendered himself, showing them the entrance to the basement and explaining the entire program. His voice shook with every sentence, like each admission chipped away at the last pieces of justification he had left. Raymond was taken to a proper hospital room upstairs, this time under real medical supervision. Harris stayed beside him until he fell asleep, looking more peaceful than before. In the days that followed, the investigation blew open a scandal that shocked the entire city. The hidden wing of the hospital was exposed, the experimental program shut down, and Keller faced charges for unlawful medical practices, falsifying records, and endangering lives. Several patients from the basement slowly regained clarity after proper treatment, revealing heartbreaking stories of how they had been admitted without full understanding of what they were agreeing to. Some families came forward claiming they had been told their loved ones were sent to special rehabilitation units without details. The truth shattered those illusions. Raymond eventually woke fully, confused but alive, slowly recovering fragments of memory from the night he disappeared. He remembered hearing strange noises in the basement, following a trail of spilled cleaning supplies, and stumbling into the hidden corridor. He remembered seeing patients wondering with blank faces, and he remembered Keller approaching him with a calm smile that didn't match his frightened eyes. Harris promised him that he would never have to set foot in that basement again. But what stayed with Harris the most was the image of the first subject who lunged at Keller. Not the violence, not the unnatural movements, but the brief flash of recognition, like a trapped mind trying desperately to break through. It haunted him for weeks. The Mullen City Hospital eventually closed its basement entirely, sealing the doors and renovating the lower floors. Official statements insisted that all experimental activity had been halted permanently. But late at night, long after the media stopped reporting on the scandal, Harris sometimes wondered if every room was truly empty, if all the subjects had been
Please
accounted
don't
for,
do
or whether
this.
the echoing footsteps he heard in his memory
We
were just
can
imagination,
find another
or something
way.
still
No,
wandering somewhere
this
in the dark.
ends